Namaste. Welcome. My name is Thomas. This is Lighthouse Yoga Evanston and our YouTube channel. Welcome back for those of you who've seen some of our other videos, and welcome to those of you who it's your first time. In these talks, I just like to introduce a little bit of reading material, things that I found useful in my practice, and just share them with you and read a little bit and then offer you some of my own insights and the things that I found useful from the text. And of course, you can communicate back through the comments in the description box below, or just send me an email through the website. Send us an email through the YouTube, and we'd be happy to hear from you. Any comments, questions, or requests for future talks. All right, so middle of October 2019, 23rd of October to be precise, and I wanted to read again The Matrix of Yoga. This is, I don't know if you can see down there, Georg and Brenda Feuerstein. Georg has since left us, but he left behind a lot of wonderful material for us to study. So, this is section 19, and it is called Community, Strength in Numbers. So I'll just read a little bit, just a little more than a page here. So, the life of a disciple in the midst of conventional society is not easy. Especially in our own time, the distractions are numerous and persistent. Solitude, which was recommended in the past as a major transformative tool, is hardly any longer available. Nor is our social environment of average people with conventional interests necessarily supportive. When television, football, bar hopping, and other similar pursuits lose their hold on a yoga practitioner, he or she increasingly feels the need for a support system. This comes in the form of a community of like-minded and like-hearted practitioners, called a Sangha in Sanskrit. This is not the usual coffee and gossip clique. Instead, the Sangha is a group of fellow disciples who are interested in practicing together or in talking about the teachings. Some, hopefully benign, gossip is natural, but the common focus is very much on the spiritual process of self-transformation. Not every Sangha, of course, meets this ideal. If the shoe doesn't fit, as they say, try elsewhere. Or if there is any openness at all, you might endeavor to introduce a different attitude, as long as you do it humbly and skillfully. If you encounter resistance, kindly and politely move on. You are certainly not the only person practicing with serious intention. You may not find a fellow pilgrim on the path in your local area, but you surely will in another district or a nearby town. You may feel tempted to practice by yourself. There is no problem if you can do this without feeling superior to others or simply resentful. Even then, however, you would certainly benefit from at least occasional participation in a group of dedicated practitioners. There is definitely strength in numbers. Besides, if you have a guru and want to spend time in his or her company, you are bound to find him or her surrounded by disciples. The guru might only sit quietly and deliver an inspiring talk. At any rate, his or her presence is predictably exhilarating, but also inherently demanding, because the guru's mere presence represents a challenge from within the disciple's mind. The challenge is a steady call for transformation, for waking up as the self. Even gurus who have not yet become enlightened can be rather demanding in this way. They call their disciples from deep within or urge them on verbally. Often they are more demanding than enlightened masters, who know that enlightenment is a game that the mind plays. The self is always the same free being, and therefore there is absolutely no urgency. The only urgency that exists is to help those for whom suffering is still a very real experience, and who, if they are spiritual pupils, struggle to realize enlightenment. Some yogins pursued liberation far removed from ordinary people in the isolation of a cave, a jungle, or a remote hut. Others did their best to attain enlightenment or a lower spiritual realization in the company of others. These traditional texts and teachers normally exhorted people to seek out the company of realized masters, or at least in the yogic sense, virtuous people. The Sangha, then, is a group of virtuous yoga practitioners who pursue the spiritual goal of freedom with integrity. Aspiring yoga practitioners are not without desires, but they seek to cultivate only those desires that do not thwart the spiritual process. As they move along on the path, their desires become ever fewer and ever more simple. They should not, of course, repress desires unless they are truly destructive. They learn to enjoy inner stillness more than boisterous external activity. So that's the end of his little section on and commentary on community and what is called the Sangha. This is one of the 3 vows in Buddhism: is I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. So you're taking refuge in the idea that you can become enlightened in the first place, or it's possible. There's this example of the Buddha. So we say, I take refuge in the Buddha because the Buddha became enlightened. I too can become enlightened. The other refuge is the Dharma, which is the teachings or the law or the path or the way or the process, right? I take refuge in the process. I trust the process. I take refuge. Right? We could unpack that word for quite a while, but we'll move on, right, to the I take refuge in the Sangha, right? And I take refuge, I trust in the Sangha that there's, as Georg said, strength in numbers, right? There's strength in that spiritual community. So very, very important, right, notion of this Sangha, right? They're taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And here we're talking about the Sangha, and I love this part where he says that you can pick and choose, right? If something doesn't feel right, if you meet a group of people who say they're on the path and they're practicing, or you find somebody who's talking about spiritual things and it doesn't resonate with you, you're free to move on, right? Not everybody makes sense to everybody else. I don't make sense to everybody. Certainly, you don't make sense to everybody, and I don't make sense to everybody all the time. You know, even the people that do understand what the heck I'm talking about half the time, they don't sometimes. So we understand that we can, you know, have these breakdowns in communication, but, you know, also thinking about like the vibe of the place, you know, like, do these people feel like they're true, they're integrated, and they're operating with a kind of ethic and as he says, a virtue in their practice. So, you know, trust yourself, trust that your own sense, your own intuition in that regard. And then he says you can practice by yourself, but the problem with practicing by ourselves is that we might become arrogant, we might become conceited, we're feeling superior, right? I'm doing such a good thing in my practice. I remember Eckhart Tolle used to joke about this. You know, you can ride a bicycle everywhere you go as long as you don't get involved with feeling superior to the person that's still driving the BMW, and you feel, you know, you're doing such a good job riding your bicycle. Or, you know, the vegetarian or the vegan movement, you know, people are feeling very superior because they don't eat meat, and this is a reason that it inflates their ego, right? So this can become the same with yoga, right? I practice yoga, I'm paying attention, I'm so conscious, right? We need to take ourselves a little less seriously in that regard, or in that instance, right? For sure, say, you know, I'm doing my practices, I'm going to look for other people who are practicing, and the people that aren't practicing, they're going to figure that out in their own time. If they're meant to study yoga or meditate, eventually they'll meditate, but that will be something that comes from inside of them, just like your practice should be coming from inside of you, not motivated by what other people are thinking of you, what other people have to say about whatever it is you're doing, right? It ultimately doesn't matter to anybody what you're doing. It doesn't matter really to anybody else what you say. It doesn't matter what I say. What matters is, you know, what's going on in my internal practice, right? How I'm meditating, how I'm doing my spiritual practices, how I'm cultivating that inner awareness and that inner connection, right? And that inner connection is only good insofar as he says is that it allows me to help those that, you know, really still take this whole suffering business seriously. So we want to check ourselves. Okay, so what else does he say? Talking about being in the presence of a guru, right? The guru is going to call you and is going to, try to speak to your heart, right? They're going to call your soul forward. They're not going to say, Thomas, stand up. They're going to say, Ananda, stand up, right? They're going to call me by my soul name. They're going to call me by my heart name, and they're going to say, you need to come and present yourself. It's time for you to give your dissertation, defend your thesis, right? You've got to be prepared. And if you aren't prepared, that's okay, but then you're going to have to either repeat that lesson or go back and do some more work, right? And then you'll get another chance to face your examination. But they're always calling us forward from that soul level. What else does he say? The only urgency that exists to helping those from suffering who's still a very real experience, and if they are spiritual pupils, struggle to realize enlightenment. Right? So this idea that we're playing a game, like the idea of the game of enlightenment or the game of suffering, right? We certainly take all of this very seriously, that we do suffer, and when we suffer, sometimes we suffer because of our suffering. It's like feeling apologetic or bad about feeling guilty. We know we shouldn't feel guilty, so then this makes us feel, oh, I'm feeling guilty, and that's what is, and I shouldn't be feeling what is, so therefore now I feel ashamed, or I feel somehow I need to apologize for feeling guilty, right? I can feel bad about my suffering, and I don't want to feel bad about my suffering, but I do suffer, and it's a fact. And if I'm practicing yoga, I start to realize slowly, little by little, that this suffering is optional, right? I don't have to be suffering like that anymore. I don't have to be going down those roads every time something pushes my buttons, right? And the same is true with enlightenment, right? They say the last desire that has to be let go is the desire for enlightenment. That desiring enlightenment is also a desire. And so when we go through these stages of looking at our fears and our desires, we eventually say, well, I don't want any of those desires. I don't want the car anymore. I don't want the house or whatever it is. I don't want the fame. What I want is to become enlightened. And certainly all the spiritual texts, they say to us, if you become enlightened, everything else will be added unto you. You'll get everything else that you ever wanted and more if you just become enlightened. So it's placed as kind of the ultimate spiritual goal, but you have to renounce all of those other material things. And this can then, be the ultimate pressure, right? And so if we look at it as a game, as something that it's the mind trying to realize its own self, or the mind coming to terms with its own limitation and eventually just dropping the idea of any further evolution or enlightenment, because the soul is already enlightened, right? It's the mind that needs to become enlightened. You don't need to become enlightened as your soul essence, but the physical 3D, flesh and bone, blood and guts human being can go through those stages of realization. And what we could call enlightenment, right? We can have this experience, and this is why the yogis say that the human birth is the precious birth, because it's only in the human birth, in the human state, that we can have that fully enlightened, consciously enlightened experience. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Let's see what else. What's the last thing he says here? Aspiring yoga practitioners are not without desires, but they seek to cultivate only those desires that do not thwart the spiritual process. As they move along the path, their desires become ever fewer and ever more simple. They should not, of course, repress desires unless they are truly destructive. They learn to enjoy inner stillness more than boisterous external activity. Right? And this is something that we should remember all the time, right? That what our aim is in the yoga practice is to simply add in the meditation, add in the mindfulness, bring yoga into your life on a moment-by-moment basis when you're washing the dishes, when you're walking down the street, especially when you're in the traffic jam or when you're rushing at the grocery store, you've got to be somewhere. That's when we really try to bring in the practice and breathe and focus on our intention, focus on our senses, our present moment experience. And the more we do that, the less we feel that we need to cover things up with distraction, or we need to go elsewhere for certain stimulus or excitement or death-defying, adrenaline junkie type of behavior, or self-destructive behavior, because all of those things ultimately, they're ways of making us feel a little bit more alive. They're ways of making us feel a little bit more, like we're living our life. Even if it's dangerous, even if it's destructive, it definitely gives us that kind of attention and the stimulus that we need. But what we're looking for is to feel that on a more subtle level, that constant inner wellspring of vitality that's bubbling up all the time, right? And if we can get in touch with this, if we can feel this, then we don't really need to feel all the other things that we could use to distract ourselves, running here and there, overly goal-oriented, seeking the next thrill or the next thing. So this is just a reminder, take some time and breathe. Hold the door for somebody. Give somebody the right of way who doesn't necessarily have it. Let somebody in front of you in line. Whatever it is, random acts of kindness make the world go round. And when you do that for other people, share that message with other people. Tell people, this really is that simple. Just to take care of each other. And if you're not in community, if you don't have that kind of Sangha, of course online there's these kinds of communities. Even though we're not together physically, there are ways in which we can connect to each other through online platforms. And being nice, just there's a whole community of people that are just out there trying to be nice to each other, and you can become one of those people. And it's a kind of secret and silent community. But you'll know each other when you see each other, because you'll be holding the door for each other. You'll be letting people in front of you in line. So I hope this was helpful. If you got anything out of this, please share it, like it, subscribe to it. And I'm grateful for you watching. Please have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Peace. Namaste.